The history of the werewolf is not written in the howls of a beast, but in the silent screams of men who looked into a mirror and saw something looking back. It is a story that begins not in the shadows of medieval forests, but in the blood-soaked soil of ancient Arcadia, where the first sin was committed and the first curse was born. In the age before memory, when God still walked among men, there ruled a king in the region of Arcadia. His name was Lycaon, and he was the son of Pelasgus, the first king of men. Lycaon was a builder of cities, a tamer of wild lands, and a father to 50 sons. But his heart, as the old poets whispered, was a thing of shadows. The myth, preserved by Ovid in his Metamorphoses and by the geographer Pausanias in his travels, tells of a test. Zeus, the king of the gods, heard rumors of Lycaon's cruelty. Tales that the king offered human sacrifices to the gods, that he delighted in the suffering of strangers. Disguised as a humble traveler, Zeus came to Lycaon's palace to witness the truth for himself. Lycaon received the stranger with hospitality, but his heart was already plotting. He decided to test whether this visitor was truly a god. He took a hostage from a neighboring tribe, a young Molossian boy, and butchered him. He boiled the flesh, roasted it, and served it to Zeus as the evening meal. The god rose from the table, his face a mask of divine fury. He overturned the feast, scattering the cursed meat. As Lycaon fled in terror, Zeus spoke the words that would echo through eternity. "You shall become what you have served, a ravenous beast, forever hungry, forever cursed." Lycaon's body convulsed. His clothes became rough fur. His arms stretched and bent, reforming into the limbs of a wolf. His voice, which had just screamed pleas for mercy, rose into a howl, a sound of such pure, agonized loss that it froze the blood of every man in the palace. He fled into the night, a creature of tooth and claw, forever separated from the world of men. But the curse did not end with Lycaon. It seeped into the soil of Arcadia like a poison. At the altar of Zeus Lycaon, the chroniclers wrote of dark rituals, men who tasted human flesh and were transformed. Plato himself in his Republic recounted the legend that those who ate the sacrificial meat at Lycaon's altar would become wolves. For 9 years, and if they abstained from human flesh during that time, they might become men again. This was the first layer of the horror. The werewolf was not a monster born, but a monster made. It was a punishment for the sin of treating human life as meat. Centuries passed. The gods of Greece faded into memory, but the fear they planted did not die. It spread north with the legions, crawled through the dark forests of Germania, and found fertile soil in the pagan hearts of the Vikings. Herodotus, the father of history, wrote in the 5th century before Christ of a people he called the Nuri, who lived somewhere beyond the Scythian plains, in the mist-shrouded lands that would one day become the Carpathians. These men, he wrote, are said to be magicians. The Scythians and the Greeks who dwell among them tell that once every year each of the Nuri becomes a wolf for a few days, and then returns again to his former shape. Herodotus was skeptical. He added, "They do not convince me, but they tell the tale nonetheless, and swear to it." But the tale persisted. It traveled along trade routes, whispered around campfires, a story of men who shed their humanity with the seasons. In the frozen north, a different kind of terror took root. The Norse sagas spoke of the Ulfednir, the wolf-skinned ones. They were berserkers, warriors who wore the pelts of wolves and fought with a fury that seemed beyond human. The Vatnsdula saga tells of men who went berserk and were called wolves of the forest. The saga of Egil Skallagrimsson speaks of Kveldolf, evening wolf, a man who as dusk fell, became moody and withdrawn, and of whom it was whispered that he had the power to change his shape. Snorri Sturluson, the great Icelandic historian, described these warriors. They went without mail coats, and were as mad as dogs or wolves. They bit their shields, and were strong as bears or bulls. They slew men, and neither fire nor steel could hurt them. This was the Hamram, the shape strong, a man whose nature was so fierce that his form could barely contain it. The horror here was not of magic, but of something deeper. These were men who chose the wolf. They worshipped Odin, the god of ecstasy and madness, and they believed that by taking on the wolf's nature, they could touch something eternal. But the price was paid in their humanity. They would return from battle empty, hollow-eyed, unable to speak of what they had done. The Christianization of Europe did not banish the werewolf. It transformed him. The old pagan shapeshifter, a figure of ambiguous power, was recast as a servant of Satan. The Church Fathers debated the matter. St. Augustine, in the 5th century, wrote in The City of God that, while demons could not truly change a man's nature, they could create illusions so powerful that men believed they had become beasts. Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century, was more cautious. He suggested that demons might indeed transform men, not by changing their substance, but by wrapping them in a kind of illusory flesh, a werewolf costume made of air and deception, convincing both the wearer and the observer. But the people knew better. They had seen the tracks. They had found the half-eaten children. The werewolf was real, and he was among them. The first great wave of werewolf trials began in the 15th century, cresting alongside the witch hunts. The Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, devoted chapters to the subject. The authors argued that while God alone could truly change a man's form, the devil could create the appearance of transformation, and that this was enough for damnation. The trials themselves paint a picture of horror beyond imagining. In 1521, 3 men in Poligny, France, confessed to being werewolves. They admitted to killing and eating children, to digging up corpses from graveyards, to serving the devil. Under torture, they named accomplices. Described sabbats where they danced in wolf form and begged for death. They were burned alive. In 1573, in Dole, France, a man named Gilles Garnier was convicted of being a werewolf. He had been seen dragging a young girl into the woods. When confronted, he fled on all fours. Under interrogation, he confessed that a specter had given him an ointment that allowed him to change his shape. He was burned at the stake, his body reduced to ashes that the winds scattered like a warning. But the most famous and the most tragic was Peter Stumpf, or Stubb, of Bedburg, near Cologne. In 1589, he was brought to trial for a decades-long career of murder, incest, and cannibalism. Under torture, and perhaps in genuine madness, he confessed to making a pact with the devil, who gave him a magic belt of wolf skin. When he wore it, he became a wolf. When he removed it, he was a man again. The details of his confession are almost unbearable to read. He described killing and eating countless victims, including his own son. He kept trophies. He laughed about it. The court condemned him to a death so grotesque it seems designed to match his crimes. He was strapped to a wheel. His flesh torn with red-hot pincers, his limbs broken with an axe, his body decapitated and burned. His daughter and his mistress, accused as accomplices, were burned alive beside him. The tragedy lies in the question that hangs over every such trial. Was he a monster, or a madman, or an innocent man broken by torture into confessing what his tormentors wanted to hear? The historical record cannot answer. Only the ashes know. Even as the trials faded, the terror did not, but found new forms. In 1764, in one region of France, a series of attacks began that would become legend. A beast, enormous, wolf-like, but wrong in ways the peasants could not articulate, began killing. It did not kill for food alone. It killed with a kind of savage joy, tearing out throats, mutilating bodies, leaving behind scenes of such carnage that grown men wept at the sight. Over 3 years, the beast of Gaveston attacked more than 200 people. It killed over 100 of them. The king sent soldiers, huntsmen, even his own personal gun-bearer. They killed wolves, many wolves, but the attacks continued. The peasants whispered that this was no ordinary wolf. It was a loup-garou, a werewolf, sent by God to punish their sins, or by the devil to mock their faith. When the beast was finally killed by a local hunter named Jean Chastel, who used a silver bullet, according to legend, the killings stopped. But the fear never died. The story of the beast of Gaveston passed into folklore, into novels, into films. It became the template for every werewolf that followed. But there is another story, quieter, more heartbreaking, that runs alongside these grand narratives of terror. It is the story of Petrus Gonçalves, born in 1537 on the island of Tenerife. Petrus suffered from hypertrichosis, a rare genetic condition that covered his face and body in thick wolf-like hair. He was brought to the court of King Henry II of France as a curiosity, a wild man, a forest creature. The courtiers called him the werewolf. They laughed at him, poked him, treated him as less than human. But Petrus was not a beast. He learned to read and write. He married a beautiful woman named Catherine, who bore him 7 children. Some of the children inherited his condition. The family became a living exhibit, studied by scientists, painted by artists, displayed for the amusement of the powerful. When you look at their portraits, painted in the 1580s, now hanging in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, you see not monsters, but people. A man with dignity in his eyes, a woman with love in her smile. Children who did not choose their faces. They were werewolves only in the frightened imaginations of those who could not see past the hair. The true history of the werewolf is not a history of monsters. It is a history of fear, fear of the wild, fear of the other, fear of the darkness inside ourselves. Every culture that has told stories of shapeshifters has been telling a story about the boundary between human and animal, and about what happens when that boundary blurs. The scientific explanations are almost sadder than the superstitions. Clinical lycanthropy is a rare psychiatric syndrome in which a person believes they are transforming into an animal. They feel their teeth lengthening, their skin growing fur, their voice becoming a growl. They are not pretending. They're experiencing a fracture in the architecture of the self so profound that the world itself seems to warp around them. Congenital hypertrichosis, the werewolf syndrome, affects perhaps 1 in a billion people. They are born covered in hair. They are called monsters. They are exhibited in circuses. They die young, often alone, always misunderstood. And then there are the real wolves, the animals that gave the legend its teeth. In the Middle Ages, wolves were everywhere, in the forests, on the edges of villages, in the nightmares of children. They were competitors for food, threats to livestock, and occasionally, when starvation drove them mad, threats to people. A wolf that learned to hunt humans was a terror beyond description. It was not a monster, it was an animal, doing what hunger compelled. But to the villagers who heard its howls in the dark, it might as well have been the devil himself. Today, the werewolf has been tamed by cinema and fiction. He is a tragic hero, a romantic anti-hero, a special effect. We forget that behind the legend lies a trail of real tears of men and women burned alive for the crime of being different, of children born with hair on their faces, and called demons, of families torn apart by fear and superstition. The last werewolf trial in Europe took place in 1692 in Livonia, modern-day Estonia. An 8-year-old man named Theses confessed to being a werewolf, but his confession was unlike any other. He claimed that he and his fellow werewolves descended into hell to fight the devil and the witches. They were, he insisted, the hounds of God. They protected the harvest, ensured the fertility of the fields, waged eternal war against darkness. The court did not know what to do with him. They whipped him, they exiled him, did not burn him because they could not decide if he was heretic or fool. Theseus may have been the last true believer, the last man who saw the wolf not as a curse, but as a gift. A warrior for God in a war no one else could see. The howl that echoes through the history of the werewolf is not a howl of rage. It is a howl of loss. Of men who lost themselves to madness or magic, or the merciless cruelty of their fellow men. Children who were born looking like wolves and died wishing they could be human. Of a world that has always been terrified of the boundary between us and them, and has always, in its fear, created monsters to explain the unexplainable. The werewolf lives not in the forest, but in the mirror. And when you look closely enough in the right light, you can still see him there. Waiting, watching, remembering the taste of human flesh and the sound of human tears.